To everyone who knew him, David Holloway was the kind of man any woman would feel lucky to marry. At 38, he worked as a regional security consultant for a private firm in Missouri. He wore his uniform with pride, carried himself with authority, and spoke with a calm confidence that made people instantly trust him. His wife, Lisa, often joked that she'd married the safest man in town. Their neighbors described the couple as picture-perfect, a well-kept house, 2 cars in the driveway, and matching coffee mugs that read his hero, her heart. Every morning, Lisa watched from the kitchen window as David left for work in his dark blue uniform, a badge clipped to his chest and a radio on his shoulder. He always left with a quick kiss on her forehead and the same reassuring line, "Don't wait up, honey. Night shifts can get long." For years, Lisa believed it all. She trusted that her husband's long nights and emergency calls were part of his demanding job in law enforcement. When friends asked what he did, she proudly said he worked with local police on high-risk security operations. In reality, no one ever saw David working with actual officers. But in a small town like theirs, no one asked many questions. Everything about David's life seemed legitimate. His SUV was outfitted with flashing lights and a mounted dash camera. His phone buzzed constantly with what he claimed were dispatch updates. Even his basement had been converted into a mini command center, maps pinned to walls, police radios crackling static, and boxes labeled evidence logs. Lisa never doubted any of it. But cracks in the illusion started to show the night David came home late with blood on his sleeve. He brushed it off as part of his job, said a suspect resisted arrest. Lisa accepted it at first, but the detail gnawed at her. The next morning, when she went to wash his uniform, she noticed the blood hadn't dried properly. Beneath it, the badge looked off, too light, too shiny. She turned it over and noticed it didn't bear the town's insignia at all. Instead, it was a cheap replica, engraved with a fake department name, Midwestern Law Enforcement Division. Lisa laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of decoy or part of an undercover operation. But curiosity took hold. Later that week, while David was out on a supposed night patrol, she searched online for the department name. Nothing came up. No records. No website. No mention in any state database. That was when unease turned to fear. Over the next few days, Lisa began noticing strange patterns. David's work phone didn't have a real carrier, just Wi-Fi calling apps. His ID badge didn't have a barcode. And when she checked the laundry basket, she found receipts, not from a police supplier, but from an online costume store that sold prop badges, tactical belts, and fake IDs. Still, she hesitated to believe it. Her mind fought the possibility that the man she loved, the man she'd built a life with, might be lying about everything. Then came the night that changed everything. At around 2 a.m., Lisa was jolted awake by the sound of tires screeching outside their house. Through the curtains, she saw her husband's SUV parked at an angle, lights flashing red and blue. 2 young men were standing on the curb, hands raised, while David shouted commands with a flashlight aimed at their faces. Her heart froze. From the upstairs window, she could see it all, her husband pretending to arrest them, handcuffing one boy, and barking orders like a real officer. She could even hear him calling into his fake radio, using codes that didn't exist. But what terrified her most was the realization that no real police ever arrived. Minutes later, David released the men, waved them off, and drove back home as if nothing happened. Lisa sat in silence as he entered the bedroom, his uniform perfectly pressed, his face calm. He kissed her cheek and whispered, "Just another long night." But that night, Lisa didn't sleep. She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the sound of her husband's fake police radio echoing faintly through the walls. She knew now that something was deeply wrong, and that she was living with a man who wasn't who he claimed to be. 4 days after that sleepless night, Lisa Holloway couldn't look at her husband the same way. Every word he spoke now sounded rehearsed. Every movement, calculated. The man she once believed to be a protector now seemed like a stranger wearing a uniform that didn't belong to him. Lisa told herself she needed proof, real evidence, before jumping to conclusions. But the more she looked, the more her doubts grew. It began with small discoveries. She noticed David's so-called patrol car had no registration plates from any official department. Instead, they were ordinary plates ordered online, designed to look authentic. Inside the SUV, she found a radar gun that didn't function, a body camera that wasn't connected to anything, and a folder filled with blank incident reports. Each page bore a fake logo, Midwestern Law Enforcement Division. It was all a performance. Lisa's mind spiraled with questions. Why would her husband go to such lengths to live a double life? Was he pretending for attention, or was it something darker? Determined to find answers, she began searching the basement, the space David called his operations room. At first glance, it looked convincing. Police scanners hummed on the table. A large map of the county was marked with colored pins. Several folders labeled suspect monitoring and ongoing cases lay scattered across the desk. But as Lisa dug deeper, she realized something chilling. None of the names or addresses listed in those files matched real police cases. Many belonged to people from their own neighborhood, random individuals who had no criminal background at all. Some were even their friends. He wasn't solving crimes. He was watching people. Lisa's stomach tightened as she flipped through more files. One folder was labeled Primary Observation, LH, her own initials. Inside were pages of notes, details about her daily routine, what time she left for work, the call she made, even what she wore. It felt like she'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare. That evening, she tried to act normal. David came home in full uniform, chatting casually about an undercover operation. He kissed her cheek, made himself dinner, and sat in front of the TV like any other night. But Lisa noticed something new, a small USB drive attached to his belt keychain. When he went to shower, she slipped it from his keys and plugged it into her laptop. What she found was beyond disturbing. The drive contained hundreds of video files, bodycam-style footage recorded from a small hidden camera. In each video, David could be seen pulling people over, flashing his fake badge, and interrogating them on dark rural roads. Sometimes he gave warnings, sometimes he issued citations that he wrote by hand on blank forms. Some victims were frightened teenagers, others were women driving home alone at night. He had been impersonating a police officer, not for one night, but for years. Lisa's pulse raced as she scrolled through the files. Each clip was labeled with dates stretching back more than 3 years. But one video made her hands tremble, a clip from just 2 weeks earlier, showing David pulling over a woman in her mid-30s. The encounter started like the others, but halfway through, the footage cut out. The file ended abruptly. No audio, no explanation. Just static. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. The next morning, she called in sick to work. While David was out, she drove to the local police department, the real one, and asked to speak privately with a detective. She brought the fake badge, the video files, and one of David's incident reports. The detective listened quietly as she explained everything. At first, he seemed skeptical. But when Lisa showed him the footage, his face changed. He told her there had been multiple reports of a man impersonating an officer in the area, pulling over unsuspecting drivers late at night. The suspect was described as wearing a dark blue uniform, matching David's exactly. The detective asked Lisa to leave the USB drive as evidence. He assured her they would begin investigating immediately, but he also warned her to act as though nothing had changed. "Don't let him know you came here," he said. "If he realizes we're onto him, it could get dangerous." That warning echoed in her head all night. When David came home that evening, Lisa forced herself to smile, to cook dinner, to laugh at his stories, even as fear gnawed at her from the inside. She kept replaying the detective's words, imagining what David might do if he discovered her betrayal. But her act wasn't enough. Just before midnight, while Lisa was brushing her teeth, David appeared silently in the doorway. His voice was calm, too calm, as he asked where his USB drive was. Her heart dropped. She tried to lie, saying she hadn't seen it, but his eyes told her he already knew. For the first time, Lisa saw something truly cold in her husband's expression, a look that made her realize the man standing in front of her wasn't pretending to be dangerous anymore. He was dangerous. Without saying another word, David turned, walked out of the bathroom, and disappeared into the night, leaving Lisa standing in silence, her reflection trembling in the mirror. That was the last time she saw him alive. When David Holloway vanished into the night, it wasn't treated as a missing person case, not at first. To police, he was a potential suspect in a string of impersonation incidents that had terrorized drivers across the state. To his wife, Lisa, he was a ghost, a man she had loved, trusted, and shared a home with, only to realize he was never who he claimed to be. The following morning, the police returned to the Holloway residence. Armed with a search warrant, they began combing through every inch of the property, the basement, the garage, and even the attic. What they found turned what seemed like a bizarre case of identity fraud into something far darker. Inside David's operations room, investigators discovered dozens of police-style uniforms from different states, none of them authentic. There were fake badges, counterfeit IDs, and stacks of handwritten citations that he had issued to victims during his so-called patrols. But the most disturbing discovery was a small locked cabinet beneath his desk. Inside were several women's driver's licenses, photographs, and personal belongings, including a bracelet engraved with the name Marissa Holt. Detectives soon realized that Marissa wasn't just another victim. She was the woman from the final video Lisa had found, the one that ended abruptly. When they ran her name through the system, they learned that Marissa Holt, a 34-year-old nurse, had been reported missing 2 weeks earlier after failing to return home from work. Her last known location? A rural highway just outside of town, the same stretch of road David frequently patrolled in his fake police SUV. It was no longer a case of impersonation. It was now a potential abduction and homicide investigation. Police immediately issued a statewide alert for David Holloway, describing him as armed, dangerous, and possibly unstable. The story spread quickly through the news. Reporters camped outside Lisa's house, cameras flashing as she tried to leave. Neighbors who once called David a hero now whispered in disbelief, wondering how they could have missed the signs. 4 days, Lisa stayed inside, haunted by guilt and fear. She kept replaying every moment, every red flag she had ignored, the fake badge, the unregistered car, the odd hours. How could she have shared a life with someone capable of such deception? Meanwhile, investigators traced David's last known movements through surveillance cameras and gas station receipts. The trail led them west, toward the outskirts of Jefferson County, a wooded area dotted with abandoned industrial buildings. There, police found his SUV, the same black vehicle with flashing lights, parked behind an old warehouse. Inside, they discovered his fake uniform, a pair of broken handcuffs, and several empty evidence bags. But there was no sign of David. The only clue was a map found on the passenger seat, the same type he used in his basement, with a red circle drawn around a remote patch of woodland near the Missouri River. Authorities immediately launched a search operation. For 3 days, teams combed through the dense forest. And then, about half a mile from the riverbank, they made a gruesome discovery. Buried beneath a layer of leaves and branches was a shallow grave containing human remains. The victim's clothing matched the description of Marissa Holt. Dental records later confirmed her identity. As investigators pieced the evidence together, a horrifying pattern emerged. David hadn't started his impersonation recently. He had been living this double life for years, using his fake authority to manipulate and control others. The videos recovered from his USB drives and hidden cameras documented dozens of illegal traffic stops across 3 states. He'd convinced people he was a federal officer, collected fake fines, and even threatened some victims with arrest. But what truly baffled detectives was how he had managed to live this lie so convincingly. When police attempted to trace his employment history, they hit a wall. There were no records of David Holloway working for any security company. In fact, the real David Holloway, the man whose social security number he was using, had died in a car accident 12 years earlier in Kentucky. The man Lisa had married wasn't David Holloway at all. His real identity was unknown. Investigators ran fingerprints from his belongings through national databases, but nothing matched. The man had left no digital footprint, no birth certificate, no tax records, nothing. He had built his life entirely on stolen identities, one after another, carefully switching names before anyone caught on. It was as if he had erased his past and rewritten himself every few years. Lisa's shock turned to horror as the pieces fell into place. The wedding license she once framed proudly on the wall was fake. Their mortgage documents had been signed under a false name. Even the life insurance policy she thought they shared was invalid. The man she thought was her husband didn't legally exist. 2 weeks after the discovery of Marissa Holt's remains, hikers in Pine Bluff State Forest, about 50 miles away, reported finding a body hanging from a tree. The man's clothes matched those David had worn the night he disappeared. His fake badge lay in the dirt beside him. The coroner confirmed the cause of death as suicide. DNA tests later identified him as the same man responsible for Marissa's death and the string of impersonations, though his true identity remains a mystery to this day. For Lisa, the discovery brought no relief. Only questions. Who was he before all this? What had driven him to live such a lie? And how many other lives had he touched under different names? In interviews afterward, she described the experience as living through a waking nightmare, loving someone who never really existed. She said she often walked through their empty house, touching the walls and furniture, realizing that every memory she had built was part of someone else's story, a fiction written by a man who had fooled everyone, even her. The case of the fake cop husband would go on to make national headlines, a chilling reminder of how far deception can go before it's discovered. But for Lisa Holloway, no headline could ever capture the true horror, of realizing that the person sleeping beside her was nothing more than a stranger in a borrowed uniform. In the weeks following the discovery of the man known as David Holloway, the story dominated national headlines. News outlets across the country referred to him as the Phantom Officer, a man who had fooled his neighbors, local authorities, and even his own wife into believing he was part of law enforcement. The case fascinated the public for one simple reason: it wasn't about a criminal pretending to be a cop for one night. It was about someone who had lived the lie for years, blending seamlessly into everyday life. Investigators revealed that the imposter had registered multiple fake companies, including one called Midwestern Tactical Security, which he used to order uniforms and equipment legally. He even held small training seminars for local businesses, teaching workplace safety and emergency response, charging hundreds of dollars per session. Nobody ever thought to verify his credentials. After all, he looked and sounded every bit the part. As more details emerged, the question shifted from how he pulled it off to why. Psychologists who studied the case suggested a deep obsession with control and authority. The fake officer didn't impersonate police for money or fame, he did it for power. Every badge, every fake arrest, every flashing light fed a fantasy that he was someone important, someone untouchable. For Lisa Holloway, that explanation offered little comfort. She had become an unwilling part of his story, the woman who lived beside the monster and never saw the signs. Overnight, her private grief turned into public scrutiny. News vans camped outside her home, and talk shows debated her role. Some called her a victim. Others accused her of knowing more than she admitted. She rarely left the house. Reporters would shout her name from across the street, asking how she could have married a man like that. She never answered. Instead, she spent her days sitting in the quiet of her living room, staring at the empty space where his fake police gear once hung. The house no longer felt like hers. Every corner reminded her of him, his fabricated routines, his meticulous lies, his false sense of order. As detectives continued their investigation, they uncovered new layers of deception. They learned that before David Holloway, the man had gone by at least 3 other aliases, each tied to a different state. In Colorado, he had posed as a private investigator. In Tennessee, as a volunteer firefighter. In Illinois, as a federal safety inspector. Each identity lasted just long enough for him to build trust, before he quietly disappeared and started again elsewhere. He was a master of reinvention, a man addicted to pretending. The most haunting part came when detectives traced the timeline back further. They found an old storage unit rented under one of his previous names. Inside were boxes of uniforms, expired IDs, and photos of himself in different roles, each uniform representing a different life. But one box stood out. It contained letters, old passports, and a worn-out family photograph. The image showed a much younger version of him, clean-shaven, smiling, holding a small child beside a woman whose face had been torn from the picture. Forensic analysts couldn't determine who the woman was. Her identity, like his, was lost to time. That single photograph became the key to understanding just how far he had gone to erase his past. Somewhere, years earlier, the man behind the badge had made a choice, to abandon his real life and create a new one. But no one could explain what had triggered that transformation. Back in Missouri, Lisa found herself drawn into endless interviews with law enforcement, therapists, and documentarians. Each wanted to understand what it was like to live with a man who didn't exist. But for Lisa, the hardest part wasn't the deception, it was the realization that she had loved a fantasy. She described how he had memorized police codes, studied law enforcement manuals, and practiced his officer voice in front of the mirror. He never broke character, not once. Even at home, his posture, tone, and routine were those of a man in uniform. She thought it was discipline. It was obsession. Eventually, Lisa decided to move out of their home. The rooms had become too heavy with memories, every wall echoing his lies. She relocated to another city, changed her name, and began rebuilding her life. But even years later, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. She described moments when she'd see a police cruiser behind her in traffic and feel her chest tighten. The flashing of red and blue lights would send her heart racing. Every siren was a reminder of the man she once trusted, and the night she discovered he wasn't real. The story took on a life of its own online. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, Reddit threads speculated about his real identity, and amateur detectives claimed he might have been connected to other unsolved cases. None of those theories were ever proven, but they fueled a sense of mystery that refused to die. One particular theory suggested that he may have once been a failed police academy recruit, someone rejected from law enforcement who couldn't let go of the fantasy. Another claimed he'd been part of a militia group that disbanded years earlier. But without fingerprints or DNA matches, the truth remained buried with him. For Lisa, the noise of speculation eventually faded. The world moved on to the next shocking story. But the scars left behind never did. She kept only one photograph from their marriage, not because she wanted to remember him, but because she wanted to remember how real the illusion once felt. In interviews years later, she said that the hardest part of recovery wasn't accepting that he lied, it was accepting that she believed him so completely. The story of the fake cop wasn't just about one man's deception. It was about the fragility of trust, and how easily appearances can replace truth when someone is determined enough to live a lie. By the end of the investigation, the FBI had catalogued over 40 confirmed impersonations linked to the man once known as David Holloway. He had infiltrated communities, conducted fake arrests, and issued fraudulent citations, all without anyone stopping to question his authority. It was a failure of awareness, but also a chilling testament to how convincing evil can look when it hides behind a badge. And for Lisa, it was a lesson carved into memory, that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones who break into your home, but the ones who build their life inside it. Years after the man known as David Holloway was found dead, the story continued to echo through true crime circles, a chilling case that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. For investigators, it remained one of the most perplexing impersonation cases they had ever handled. Despite the nationwide coverage and forensic advances, his real name was never identified. Every trace of his previous life, birth records, school files, fingerprints, had either been erased or never existed under his assumed identities. The man had effectively erased himself from the world. But for Lisa Holloway, the story was far from over. She spent the next few years living quietly under a new name, trying to rebuild her life in the shadow of her husband's deception. Though she never gave another television interview, she agreed to participate in a closed documentary years later, not to relive the trauma, but to warn others about the dangers of misplaced trust. She spoke softly, her voice steady but distant. She described how easily David had earned people's confidence, how effortlessly he carried authority. He wasn't charismatic in the traditional sense, he was convincing. His uniform, his tone, his mannerisms, they projected control, and people rarely questioned control. Lisa said that was what scared her most, how many times he must have used that same calm authority to manipulate strangers. In the years following the case, law enforcement agencies across several states reviewed their policies around impersonation. The FBI even issued new training materials on identifying fake credentials, citing the Holloway case as a textbook example of how obsession and deception can merge into something lethal. Detectives later revealed one disturbing detail they had kept from the public. In one of the storage lockers linked to David's aliases, investigators found handwritten journals. Inside were hundreds of pages filled with patrol notes, mock arrest records, and personal reflections. One entry read, "No one questions the badge. The badge gives you everything: power, respect, obedience. Without it, you're invisible." That sentence would become the defining quote of the case. Experts believed those writings showed signs of delusional thinking, a man detached from reality, convinced that his fabricated identity gave him purpose. But for others, it painted a darker picture of a man who simply enjoyed control. As the years went on, new information trickled in. A retired detective from Tennessee recognized the man's face from an old unsolved case involving a security consultant who disappeared after being accused of harassment. Another report surfaced from Illinois about a man running fake safety inspections under a different alias. Each lead brought investigators closer, but never to a definitive identity. Whoever he once was, the real man had vanished long before his body was found. For the public, the fascination turned to fear. True crime channels dissected every detail, online communities built elaborate timelines, and amateur sleuths attempted to match his face to missing person databases. Some even speculated he might have had military training or a background in private security, given his knowledge of law enforcement language and tactics. But there was one thing everyone agreed on: he was not an ordinary imposter. He was someone who had built a second life with precision, using deception not to steal money or fame, but to construct an entirely new existence. Lisa's life, meanwhile, became a quiet reflection of survival. She sold their old home, moved states, and changed professions. She avoided small towns, preferring cities where anonymity offered safety. She stopped answering questions about her past and, for years, lived as a different person, much like the man she once loved, but for entirely different reasons. Yet, no matter how far she moved, the memories followed. In the documentary's final interview, Lisa said she often dreamed of the sound of his fake police radio, the static, the dispatch codes, the illusion of authority that once comforted her. Now, that sound filled her with dread. She said she could still picture the blue lights flashing through their bedroom window, the night she realized everything was a lie. She described that night as the exact moment her world broke in half, before and after she knew the truth. In one of the closing scenes, the documentary narrator summarized it best. He wasn't just pretending to be a police officer, he was pretending to be human. Every part of his identity, from his name to his marriage, was an act. And in the end, the only real thing about him was the damage he left behind. The Holloway case became a cautionary tale, one that reminded people that evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes, it looks ordinary. Sometimes, it smiles at you every morning. Even after all these years, Lisa kept one item from their home, his fake badge. She didn't keep it as a reminder of him, but as a warning. It sat inside a small glass box, locked away, a symbol of what deception can become when left unchecked. The real tragedy wasn't just the victims he deceived or the life he took. It was the years of trust, the countless ordinary moments that turned out to be nothing but performance. By the time the story faded from headlines, the man who called himself David Holloway had become a ghost story in true crime circles, a mystery that haunted investigators and fascinated audiences. A man who fooled an entire town, lived a lie so convincingly that it became truth, and destroyed every life that intersected with his own. In the end, all that remained was a question that would never be answered. Who was he, really? And perhaps, for Lisa, that unanswered question was the only mercy left. Because sometimes, not knowing the full truth is the only way to survive it.